now we move on to Michael Roberts. Michael worked as an economist in the City of London for various financial institutions for over 40 years. In the heart of the beast, he says. He's written several books, including The Great Recession, A Marxist View, The Long Depression, World in Crisis, Marx 200 and Engels 200. That was his latest volume. He's joint author with G. Carducci of a forthcoming book, maybe it's out already, to be published by Pluto Press, Capitalism in the 21st Century Through the Prism of Value. He actually produces a regular blog commenting on the capitalist crisis and important economic developments. And if you don't read it, you should become a follower because it's extremely informative. So over to you, Michael.
Well, thank you very much, Jenny. I know we haven't got much time, us participants, in this review, and there are so many things to cover in this book that I'm not going to be able to do that. I hope to put something down in writing later on in the next few weeks to review the book and give it the promotion it deserves. Let me start by saying I think Alberto and Elias have come forward with a very ambitious and profound attempt to reanalyze the nature of the economies that carry through the overthrow of capitalist states. There's not many of them, and so we need to understand what happened in those and what has happened since capitalism and the state controlling on behalf of capitalism was removed in countries like the Soviet Union, China, and Vietnam, Laos, and others that have been mentioned already, and also Cuba that has not been mentioned so far. And I agree with the general strand of the book, which is that China is not a capitalist economy in the sense that the capitalist class does not control the state. It doesn't dominate the economy, although it's a very sizable section of the economy, as has already been explained by other reviewers. But the dominant controlling sector of the economy remains the state and the public sector in general, and also the ability to plan, at least at a macro level, the way in which the economy is to be structured in terms of investment and dealing with the crises that can come up. And we can see that as a result. I don't need to repeat this too much to remind you that China avoided a slump in the Great Recession of 2008-9. In fact, it's avoided all the slumps that capitalism has had since 1950, and there has been, I can't remember how many now, but at least a dozen, and getting worse on each occasion. So on anybody who starts from the point of view of saying, well, capitalism is just operating in China just like any other country, as John Ross has pointed out, is really talking nonsense. They've not looked at the evidence. But having said that, I have to ask myself whether this socialist-oriented economy, if you to use the author's terms, is sufficiently explained in the book, particularly those aspects of the which I think are rather important, namely the role of law of value in China and other countries, and that relates to the theory of Marxist theory of value, and also the nature of the transition that's taking place in China, in particularly in relation to what I think is perhaps missing from the book, which I'll come to in a moment, is the serious contradictions which Peng has outlined to some extent that exist in China and other economies like that at the moment. Now, let me just deal with a theoretical one for viewers, which hasn't been discussed in the book, and it's in the book. There is quite a long discussion of the theory of value and the labor theory of value in the book as Marx developed it. And actually, the authors reach a conclusion, as far as I can follow, they can correct me if I'm wrong, that they actually think Marx didn't quite get the theory of value right. And they prefer the interpretation or the explanation of value theory provided by the neo-Ricardian Piero Sraffa. And they accept the view that Marx had errors in his understanding of the process of value and how it operated in a commodity market economy. And as a result, we need a weaker, to use their phrase, I think, acceptance of the labor theory of value, where surplus is what matters, not surplus value. Now, it seems to me if we move in that direction, we're allowing a merger between the basic mode of production under capitalism, which is production for surplus value and the accumulation of profit by private accumulation, and it's surplus value that is the criteria under capitalism, which drives the capitalist production. If we're now just going to talk about surplus, as the authors point out, all economies develop surpluses. The question is how they're controlled, operated, and appropriated. And that is not clear that they're making any particular distinction any longer if they adopt Sraffa's position, which I think a long series of Marxist economists, particularly over the last 20 or 30 years, some of whom are participating in this meeting, have spent some time in refuting Sraffa's position. So I was surprised to see that appear to get a favourable reception in the book. And I think you might say to viewers, well, who cares whether they think Sraffa's right or Marx is right? Well, I think it does matter because it relates also to the nature of the transition from capitalism to socialism, which the authors also deal with and outline. And if you, I think, look at the book, I seem to think that basically they think that Marx also made mistakes and has got an incorrect view about the transition towards socialism and communism. I think at one point they refer to the two stages that Marx talks about for communism, the lower stage and the higher stage, or for Lenin's interpretation, the socialist stage and the communist stage. Marx talks about a lower and higher stage of communism, so does Engels, while Lenin talks about socialism being the same as the lower stage. Now, they're saying, I think, that communism is like a far-off dream, and that in the meantime, we have to concentrate on moving towards socialism. But if we read the Kotter program carefully and what Marx's view is, you may disagree with Marx, but he seems to be saying that both socialism and communism, or both the lower stage of communism and the higher stage of communism, imply the end of commodity production. Commodity production no longer operates under socialism. A state has begun to disappear. Commodity production is no longer not only dominant, but has become a minority and is gradually disappearing and should disappear if the process of transition towards socialism is taking place. Now, that clearly is not the case in China or these other countries. Quite the reverse. Commodity production is a sizable proportion of the operation of what's going on in China. So we have to ask ourselves, is the process of going towards socialism fully justified by the argument that actually socialism can include commodity production, which is what our authors, Elias and Gabriel, are offering to us. They're saying basically it's market socialism. By that may mean, yes, the state's in control or dominant, but commodity production operates, and commodity production will continue to operate under socialism. It's going to be a form of market socialism. As far as I'm concerned, that's certainly would, I believe, be an anathema to Marx and Engels. They did not consider you could have market socialism. And also, it leaves out perhaps one of the most important things, which is the nature of the contradiction that raises between commodity production under capitalism and a planned economy with social control and ownership by the people as a whole. I'm reminded of what Che Guevara said when a lot of people in Cuba raised the question of market socialism as the way forward. He said, the law of value and planning are two terms linked by a contradiction. It's a Trojan horse of socialism to talk about the law of value operating in socialism in the form of a market socialism. Because in such a hybrid system, if it was to exist for any length of time with capitalist elements, it provokes a contradiction which can only eventually be resolved in favour of capital. And that seems to me the danger that we have with all the economies supposedly transitioning towards socialism when the capitalist sector is so strong. And what we would be expecting in the transition to socialism is that the market sector of the economy would begin to shrivel and that we would see an expansion of the planned socially owned sector where everything is produced through direct production and not through commodity exchange. And we could hardly describe China as being in that position. And that brings me to the other worry I have about the book, that there is no discussion of the contradiction which exists between those two modes of production that exist in China or elsewhere. It's as though the capitalist mode of production can be incorporated into the so-called socialist mode of production in a complementary and harmonious way. when I consider that against, say, the Marxist economist Preobrazhensky, when he looked at the question of the Soviet Union and the primitive socialist accumulation, Preobrazhensky's work on the development of the Soviet economy was precisely to oppose the contradiction between the development of commodity production, the private sector and capitalism, and the development of the plan and the socialist sector. And these two were in contradiction. And he discussed how that could possibly develop over the whole period. By the way, as far as I could tell, I looked at the index, Preobrazhensky is not mentioned at all in the book, which suggests to me, again, that there's a lack of recognition that there is a serious contradiction between the capitalist sector in China and the state-run sector as well. One of the other big things that's missing from an understanding of the move towards socialism, let me remind viewers, at least those who have read Marx and Engels on this question, even before we get to socialism, with the dictatorship of the proletariat, which means basically the overthrow of the capitalist state and its replacement by a workers' state, or workers in control of the state machinery to begin with in order to plan towards socialism, you started from two basic democratic principles, both developed by Engels and recognized by Lenin. The right of recall of all the officials, without the whole had to be elected and recalled, and no official to earn more than 4 times the average wage of the worker. That was the attempt to keep control of the state machine in the hands of the workers and to allow the development of workers' democracy as a way of taking forward the transition to socialism. Do those criteria apply to any of the transitional economies mentioned in the book? Are those two criteria of workers' democracy mentioned in the book? It's as though these are not relevant to the process of the transition to socialism. And I think they are very relevant, and they cannot be ignored, that any transitional economy where the state machine is not under the control of workers being able to recall their officials, and is where the state machine and the top officials are earning way, way more than the average wage and conditions of workers, just as we see in a capitalist state, threatens the very basis of democratic workers' control of the state, and therefore, in my view, a transition effectively towards socialism. So the result is, viewers, that what we have to recognize is a serious contradiction mentioned by Peng in the case of Shanghai between the capitalist sector and the state sector, the plan which threatens the whole process of the transition to socialism. That contradiction we see revealed increasingly at the present moment, not only over the attitude of the Shanghai leadership and the private sector in the lockdown, but also look at the real estate disaster which has now appeared in China as a result of privatizing the real estate sector. Instead of having state housing at rent at reasonable prices and expanding that over the last 30 years, the Chinese leadership went for a completely privatized real estate developing sector based on debt. And as a result, we now have serious inequalities in China. The inequality of income in China and the inequality of wealth in China cannot be described as socialist or moving towards socialist. Far from inequalities declining and narrowing and converging, it's not taking place. Yes, 850 million people have been taken out of destitute poverty over the last 40 years. It is a demonstration of the power of the state sector, the planning mechanism, and the opposition to the capitalist mode of production. But the capitalist mode of production operates seriously in China, and as a result, the inequalities exist not only between urban and rural workers, but also between billionaires and the average worker in the cities as well. And we have a huge range of these various billionaires and private venture capitalists who continue to operate in China. It seems to me, as Che Guevara puts it, we have a Trojan horse for the transition to socialism as a result. And that's something the book seems to ignore, in my view, implying that there is a sort of harmonious equilibrium that we can achieve with this new social economic formation, with commodity production and the law of value and state planning for an indefinite future. I don't think we do have an indefinite future of harmonious connection between the two. And that we have to be aware of. There's a serious risk of reversal of all the gains that China has made, that the Soviet Union also made. I think they did make gains. I agree with John Ross that not by the 60s and 70s, they're unable to progress any further. Well, we cannot deny the tremendous gains made by the state sector and planning in the period after the revolution of 1917. But it was reversed in the Soviet Union. We went back to shock therapy, back to capitalism. Look what we have now, Putin's capitalist Russia. There is a danger that could happen as well in the case of China, unless we recognize that there is a serious contradiction developed between the law of value, planning mechanism, and workers' control and democracy. And although the book makes a brave and wonderful attempt to explain how China has been and how it's developed in this new social economic formation, what I think it seriously lacks is a recognition of that contradiction and the recognition of the risk of reversal.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.